Greetings YouTube, this is Remarkable Republican, and today I would like to talk about my research into the French Revolution. Namely, my research proving that the French Revolution and its leader Napoleon Bonaparte were in fact Muslims. Many people are fond of comparing Napoleon and Hitler and saying that Napoleon was the Hitler of the 19th century. While that in itself is true, and I would point out that whereas Hitler was fond of using gas chambers to kill the people he didn't want, Napoleon used them as soldiers and let them die to accomplish his ends. The difference is actually that Napoleon is more evil. Hitler was an atheist, and that took away any kind of morals he might have had, but it also limited his ambitions because he only saw this world. Napoleon, on the other hand, was an Islamic extremist. Now, you might not have heard this before, but it is true. And we all know that Islamic extremists have extremist goals, including the complete transformation of human society for the worst. So let me show you my proof. In 1799, Napoleon arrived in Egypt with a large army, a fleet, and a group of scholars. His mission, as he told everyone, from the Turkish officials in Constantinople to his own government to the locals, was to end the Mamluk control of Egypt and restore Quranic law. Now, that seems like a very odd thing for a supposedly atheist French government to be funding, but Napoleon managed to convince the French government that attacking Egypt was their way to defeat Britain. But really, I think that his stated purpose is his actual goal. Because if you look at the amount of effort he put into translating things into Arabic, he put an immense amount of time into learning the Quran, and he never denounced his plans in later life, or his intention when he was in Egypt of becoming a Muslim. From the moment he set sail to Egypt, Napoleon had every intention of assimilating himself into Egyptian culture, and that included adopting Islam as his religion and using Arabic as his primary language. However, it was not to be. In his proclamations, Napoleon declared his support for Islam and his defense of all Islamic people against persecution. However, the problem is that some of his soldiers did not feel the same way. Now, while they themselves did in fact succumb to Islam, the fact remains that they wanted to be a ruling class within Islam as Frenchmen over the local Egyptians. Napoleon was more interested in creating a kind of equality in Islamic brotherhood, whereas the French saw themselves as conquering heroes and as being products of a superior Western Islamic culture. So, because of that, there was considerable tension between Napoleon and his men when they started to convert to Islam and really become assimilated into the local culture. In his memoirs, Napoleon wrote that his grand scheme was to create a pan-Islamic empire with himself as the emperor. He conceived of the Islamic world as being a cohesive whole, which is the same kind of concept that groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda have of what the Islamic world should be like. They don't believe in nationhood or nationality in the way that Europeans do. Now, Napoleon, to that end, was working to win over the locals. He had a bunch of things translated into Arabic with all the scholars he brought with him. In one letter to Islamic leaders, he stated, quote, "We are friends of Muslims and of the Prophet, and we desire to do all we can to please you and be favorable to your religion," end quote. And Napoleon did do as much as humanly possible to appease the local Muslims. Napoleon tried to Islamicize himself to a great extent, and one of the key ways he did that was by hiring an Armenian Mamluk by the name of Rustam Raza to be his personal bodyguard. Rustam Raza, being connected to the local Muslim community, was able to ward off a lot of assassination attempts, and it's possible that their lifelong friendship had a sexual component, although that is not really provable, and we know that Napoleon was most likely not gay because he had many lovers and fathered a number of illegitimate offspring. Despite Napoleon's jihad on behalf of Allah, he was not able to rouse the Egyptian people into enough anger against the Mamluks to convince them to follow him. he was not able to fill them with the notions of liberty and all the other things that are supposedly the hallmarks of the French Revolution. And there are two reasons. One, as I'll prove later, the French Revolution was in fact a revolution towards Islamic rule in France, one, but also the Egyptian people historically have always been rather lazy and accepting of tyranny. So Napoleon was not really able to get them to fight for their own rights and fight for Islamic idealism, which is what he was striving for. Without support from the unreliable Egyptians, Napoleon decided to invade the Middle East, so he went up into Palestine, and shockingly, they proved to be no better as people because they also follow Islamic morality, and they also live in a hot environment which encourages laziness. Now, Napoleon was ultimately undermined when his troops got sick, and he left some people behind to prevent them from spreading plague. And the reason why his soldiers sort of began to become seditious is because they looked at Napoleon and they saw a man who was rapidly becoming an Arab Muslim. And they thought to themselves, well, I don't think I can follow this man. He seems like he is coming unglued and he's adopting local morality. So they began to become disloyal, and Napoleon eventually departed from Egypt and left them to their fate, which ended up being death. But why did Napoleon bring all those scholars with him, and what did they do after they were done writing to all the local priests about their dedication to Islam? Well, these guys were set to work studying ancient Egypt after that. And the reason is twofold. One, Napoleon was genuinely interested in the ancient past because he was an educated European. But two, he also had become a Shia Muslim, which is a specific type of Muslim who was really interested in mysticism. And he saw that the roots of all mysticism were in the ancient Egyptian religion in the hieroglyphs. Now, while a lot of modern Muslims don't make that connection, Napoleon was a very well-educated Muslim by this point, and he saw the connections between the ancient Egyptian religion and their modern system of belief, both of which are essentially pagan and satanic. So Napoleon began having people investigate the pyramids, and that led to some, quote, discoveries, all of which are mostly complete nonsense. And Napoleon really tried to learn from these things, and he was also looking for sort of unholy relics that could give him special powers, but he never found any. And he also left the scholars there to their doom because he no longer needed them. There are no pyramids to study in France, and he didn't think that a lot of them were very good Muslims, so he really saw no reason to bring them home. Atheism is the rejection of the true God, and the true God is the God of Christianity. Now, Islam is also the rejection of the true God in favor of a fake moon god from Arabia called Allah. So the two are at least allied if they're not exactly identical. However, since atheism is the lack of a belief and it gives absolutely no moral standing to anybody, the fact remains that people will be left wanting, and they'll eventually succumb to the stronger and more persuasive moral force. So every atheist out there is a potential Muslim, and actually almost all of them at some point, or their children, will probably become Muslims, since Islam is the fastest growing religion in the world. At least assuming that Christians sit idly by and let their culture be raped by atheism and Islam. So the thing is, Napoleon in Egypt didn't necessarily directly persecute Christians. However, he was best friends with a notorious persecutor. This is Ahmed Pasha. He was the governor of the city of Acre, and his nickname was the Butcher because of what he did to local Christians. Napoleon chose this man to be one of his local allies, and he wrote to him praising Islam and ignoring his crimes towards Christians. Now, why would he do this? Well, Napoleon, as a Muslim, also hated Christians, and when he returned home to France, he never did anything to help them either. And this was his way of doing it. Napoleon was not the kind of guy to go out there and be his own hitman. He had other people do his dirty work, and he allowed Ahmed Pasha to persecute Christians on his behalf in the Middle East. Most Westerners are naive about Napoleon's true history, but in the Islamic world, this has been remembered quite a bit better. They know whose side Napoleon was on, even if their ancestors weren't quite smart enough to latch on to him and build a pan-Islamic empire or a caliphate or whatever you want to call it. And that is why we were spared ISIS 200 years ago, and why it's taken till now for things like ISIS to build up an empire. If Napoleon had been in charge, being the general that he was, then we know that Islam would have been a major threat to Western civilization in 1800. But fortunately, local Muslims in Egypt were really stupid, and they didn't embrace this opportunity. Napoleon was complex, and in addition to his Islamic sentiments, he was also an admirer of Marxism. And one of the key tenets of Marxism is multiculturalism, so Napoleon appointed as one of his generals a black man named Dumas, who is related to the famous author Alexander Dumas. This gentleman came from Haiti, and he was obviously black, like Lando Calrissian or Neil deGrasse Tyson or somebody of that nature. Now, this inclusion of him as a general was an early form of affirmative action, and it's driven by the same kind of nonsense which later Hillary Clinton would turn into a complete political career. If you don't believe me, listen to any speech she's ever given. Before he went to Egypt, Napoleon was seen as a bright young man who was an upstanding individual and someone who had a lot of potential and who was a real champion of France. But when he got home, he became a complete tyrant. Egypt changed him. Not only the betrayal of the locals and the failure of himself to set up this Islamic empire, but by becoming a Muslim and by really becoming infused with the values of the East, Napoleon degenerated into an unrecognizable monster. You see here he's depicted as a crocodile king, just like a Nile crocodile, and all the French are represented as frogs who can only talk and talk and talk, but never act. These are these atheist revolutionaries who have no balls, and you have Napoleon coming in with his jackbooted thugs. And this is why France has been slowly but surely becoming an Islamic state over the last few centuries. It's because of Napoleon bringing the infection from Egypt. This has been Remarkable Republican, bringing you the truth with a truth-flavored bias, signing out.